Hi, my name is Nhyira. Welcome to the Premium ICA lecture videos and welcome to the lecture videos on public sector accounting and finance. Today we will be discussing issues in relation to public procurement. So far we have looked at the introduction to public sector accounting, where we look at the definition of public sector, the objectives of public sector. We've also considered the issues in relation to users of public sector accounting information. We have discussed issues in relation to the differences between public sector accounting and private sector accounting. We have also discussed issue in relation to the various accounting bases that we have: the cash basis, the accrual basis, the commitment basis, the modified cash basis, the modified accrual basis. Then we also spoke about the accounting systems, and we spoke about issues in relation to vote accounting, fund accounting, project accounting, environmental accounting, donor accounting, among other issues. Then we also considered privatization, why government will undergo privatization, and that was what we did in the introduction. Then we came to the regulatory framework of public sector accounting and finance. We saw the various regulatory frameworks that governs public sector accounting. We said the 1992 Constitution is the first thing that governs everything. It is the supreme law of the land. We spoke about the Financial Administration Act, the Financial Administration Regulations Act. We spoke about the Internal Revenue Act, the Public Procurement Act, all and other acts that governs the issues in relation to public sector accounting and finance. We call them the regulatory frameworks. Then from there we considered the issues in relation to the functions or roles of some authorities, or some people I call players in public sector accounting. We saw the functions of the executive arm of government, the parliament, and we said the executive arm of government, they make the policies of the country, and whatever policy they make, the president with the cabinet must be approved by parliament. And so we said that they make the policies for the entire country. Then we also came to the functions of parliament. We said parliament has function, or renders its function, in three categories: that is appropriation, audit control, and the last one is public accounts through the Public Accounts Committee. Then we saw the roles of the Controller and Accountant General, the Auditor General, the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning. Then we also considered the functions of heads of various departments, agencies, ministries, metropolitan municipal district assemblies. So under the regulatory frameworks, these were what we discussed there. Then in our last video, we saw the issue in relation to public fund, and we said that according to the 1992 Constitution, the public fund of Ghana shall be the consolidated fund and the contingency fund, as well as any other fund that Parliament deems it fit. Now, unless there is an act to govern, every public fund shall be governed according to the 1992 Constitution. And we saw these other funds to be the road fund, the petroleum fund, the sinking fund, the revolving fund, the counterpart fund, and we saw how each of these funds looked at. And we also mentioned the public or the district assembly common fund. Then we discussed issues in relation to the various challenges that the District Assembly Common Fund is facing and why it is not utilizing or achieving its goals. We also considered issues in relation to government revenue and expenditure processes, where we spoke about the various revenue of government. We spoke about taxable revenues, directors, indirectors, and the non-taxable revenues. We also spoke about the expenditure processes, and we said that an expenditure is committed when a warrant is issued, and we saw the various authorization levels. We saw the national, we saw the ministerial, we saw the departmental, we saw the divisions, and so how the hierarchy of the warrant is issued. And we discussed the components of government revenue, the components of government expenditure. Then when we come to the expenditure, we looked at how the government controls various expenditure of the country. We spoke about freezing of votes, we spoke about directive, and we also considered issues in relation to when it comes to the payment processes, how the government does the payment processes and the various portions that goes to each of the expenditure items. So far, these are some of the things that we have discussed in our videos in relation to public sector accounting and finance. And today we want to take our next topic, that is called public procurement. This is one of the central subjects when it comes to public sector accounting and finance, and it is an area that the examiner in each examination sitting will have a question that he would want to ask candidates and ask their idea and opinions upon what they understand when it comes to public sector accounting and finance. So you have our books there in relation. You have our book there in relation to the public sector accounting and finance, and then from there we would be dealing with public sector accounting and finance. But as the lecturer for this course, I have decided to re-prepare the notes on public sector public procurement in a 6-page. So the entire topic in your book has now been prepared and narrowed down into a 6-page document, and you hit me in my email and I can send you the summary of the public procurement, the key things that you are supposed to understand and prepare for the examination. It is my greatest hope and desire that at the end of this video you will be able to achieve and be able to understand what we spoke or we are coming to talk about. Now someone may ask, what is public procurement? So let's begin the journey. Public procurement refers to the process through which goods, services, and works are financed either wholly or in part by public institutions for public purposes. So anything that involves the purchases of goods, services, works for public purposes to be used by the government, and the government finances that either in part and in whole must be acquired through what we call the public procurement. Now, public procurement in Ghana is governed by an act called the Public Procurement Act 2003, and that public procurement is led by a board with a chief executive officer and then a minister of procurement. So when you're talking about public procurement, it is about the purchases of goods, services, and works that is either financed in part or in whole by government and for public purposes. So it is governed by the Public Procurement Act 2003, and it is led by a board with a CEO and a Minister of Procurement, as we currently have in Ghana. Now, this act is what governs public procurement, the 2003 Act. So everything we are coming to do here, we are going to draw it from the Public Procurement Act. Whatever we are going to discuss, it's what we must know and what is contained in the Public Procurement Act. Now, so what we have to realize is, what is the scope of this act? In other words, what is the length of coverage of the Public Procurement Act? That is what we want to look at right now. The act applies to the procurement of goods, works, and services financed in whole or in part from public funds, except where the minister decides that it is in the national interest to use a different procurement. So the Public Procurement Act, it refers to procurement of goods for national purposes. So for national purposes, anything that we have to use for the nation, for government purposes, we have to use it or procure the goods according to what is laid down in the Public Procurement Act. It applies to central management agencies, ministries, department agencies, subvented organizations. These are organizations who governments give money to undertake specific projects. Government institutions, public universities, public schools, colleges and hospitals, the Bank of Ghana, among other public institutions or organizations. So the Procurement Act applies to all these organizations who have the interests of the government and who are financed either wholly or in part by the government. So that is the scope of the Public Procurement Act. Now we want to look at the structure of the public procurement, and that is what you can see behind me on the board. So structure of public procurement in Ghana. The structure of public procurement in Ghana is, as I have said already, is led by the Public Procurement Authority. It was first called the Public Procurement Board, but has now been changed to the Public Procurement Authority. So whether you see Public Procurement Board or Public Procurement Authority, we are still talking about the governing body of procurement in Ghana. So we have the Public Procurement Authority, Then we come down to public procurement entities, we come down to tender committees, we come down to tender evaluation panel, then we come down to tender review boards, then we come to the local government. So that is the structure of public procurement here in Ghana. That's the structure of public procurement here in Ghana. So we are going to look at the functions and the roles that each of these entities or bodies play in the structure of procurement. But let me give you an idea of that. The Public Procurement Authority is the one that looks over, supervises, and looks over the entire procurement business in Ghana, the public procurement business in Ghana. However, procurement entities are the various organizations as we have listed, like the Bank of Ghana, like public universities, like government organizations, like government institutions, like subvented organizations or institutions. All these are public procurement entities. But the Minister of Procurement, in consultation with the board, can declare any entity or individual at all to be a procurement entity. When the government does that, or when the minister takes that decision, it means that that entity or that individual is going to be financed either in whole or in part by the government of Ghana. So in each procurement entity, there has to be established a tender committee. We will look at their functions. In each procurement entity, there has to be established a tender review panel. In each procurement entity, there has to be established tender evaluation panel, then the tender review board. So all of these are contained in a procurement entity, and they have various roles that they play that enable these procurement entity to procure for their goods and services. Then we will look at procurement in the local government, that is the metropolitan, municipal, district assemblies. How do they also undertake procurement at the local government level? So we will also consider that in relation to how that is done. So let's look at the functions of the Procurement Authority. It's very important. I've already said that the Procurement Authority oversees the public procurement in Ghana here. So they oversee the entire procurement in the country. But what are their major functions that they perform, or what are the roles that they play? One, they make proposal, or the board makes proposal for the formation of policies on procurement. So they make proposals to form policies, whether we have to make a modification or an amendment to the act, whether to allow for certain things to be done. So they make formation for policies, proposals for policies to be made. Two, monitor and supervise public procurement in the country. As we have said, it is the body that oversees the entire procurement in the country. So it's supervise and monitor to see whether the procurement entities are carrying out procurement as stated in the Procurement Act. Development of public procurement documents such as rules, directives, instructions, or other regulations. So they also develop public procurement documents. So anything that they think will help the public procurement, and not necessarily amending the act, they give those directives, they give those instructions, they give those regulations to the public procurement entities and the local government, so that procurement will be improved in the country. Then preparation and presentation of annual reports on procurement. So they have a responsibility to prepare and present the annual report on procurement and present it to the Minister of Finance, present it to the Minister or the Controller and Accountant General, give a copy to the Auditor General, then send a copy to Parliament, as well as the other bodies who may be interested. Government advisor on public procurement issues. So when it comes to any issue on procurement, it is the Procurement Authority that governs the government as to what it has to do and how it has to procure for certain goods that must be bought in the name of the country or to be used to undertake a project for the country. And then the final one I would want to talk about is the maintenance of public procurement entities. Because they overlook the entire public procurement in their country, they are there to maintain public procurement entity. So if there is a public procurement entity that is not doing its job as laid down in the Public Procurement Act or as directed by the Minister of Procurement or the board, then it means that the procurement entity may be dissolved or may be wind up so that it will not create any injury to parties or tenderers, but will bring sanity into the procurement of the goods for government purposes. So these are some of the functions that the Public Procurement Board or the Public Procurement Authority plays. And in your book, I listed about 12 or 15 of them, and you can read more of them, but I discussed only 6 of them here in our video for brevity of time. Now, these are some of the things the Public Procurement Authority does, but there are things that the Public Procurement Authority don't do. Three of them, and we want to discuss that. There are 3 things that the Public Procurement Authority does not do, and we want to look at that. 1, procure for or on behalf of any government entity. The authority does not procure for goods on behalf or for any government entity. 2, award any contract for or on behalf of any government entity. They are not there to award contracts because it is the procurement entities who are empowered to award contracts, who are empowered to procure goods. And then 3, invite tenders for or on behalf of any government entity. They don't invite tenders on behalf of anybody because they don't undertake for any government or for any government entity or on behalf of any government entity, because it is the procurement entity that does all these jobs. So that is what we have to understand when it comes to the functions, that is the do's and the don'ts of the Public Procurement Authority. Then how is the Public Procurement Board or Authority financed? Parliament, through appropriation, grants the board with such money as it may require. So any amount of money at the 3 months before the year ends, they are supposed to submit their budget to the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance includes that budget into the national budget, and it is presented to Parliament. And so Parliament now appropriates and then approved. If Parliament approves it, then that money is allocated to the Public Procurement Board to pay for its administrative expenses or its day-to-day running of the Public Procurement Board. Accounts and audits. The board shall keep records and prepare annual accounts as prescribed by the Controlling Accountant General and approved by the Auditor General. So they are giving money. So at the end of the year, they must give us results. They must give us accounts. They must let us know how they have been the stewards of the funds that have been entrusted into them, what was the money used for, who was paid from the money, and what were the things that we bought with the money. So these are what we have to understand when it comes to the Public Procurement Authority or Public Procurement Board. The next in the hierarchy is the Public or Procurement Entity. A procurement entity is responsible for procuring or procurement of goods, services, and work. So the procurement entity, they are the people, they are the individuals, organizations, and institutions that is empowered or that are empowered by the act, by the law, by the board, by the CEO, by the Minister of Procurement to procure goods for government purposes, to be used for government purposes. Now, the minister may, in consultation with the board, by notice in a gazette, declare any entity or individual to be a procurement entity and shall carry out its duties as laid down in this act or by the board. So I have said that already, that the minister, in consultation with the board of the Public Procurement Authority, can declare any individual or entity at all to be a procurement entity. However, upon the declaration of an individual or an entity to be a procurement entity, that individual or that entity must now be ready to carry out procurement as laid down in the Public Procurement Act or as directed by the Public Procurement Board or Authority. So that is what we have to understand in relation to procurement entities. Then we come down to tender committees. That's the third one, tender committees. Each procurement entity shall have a tender committee that will be responsible for, so each procurement entity shall have a tender committee. So it is a procurement entity that establishes the tender committee so that they undertake certain roles or they perform certain functions. So they will be responsible for, one, ensuring that each stage of the procurement activities in this act and recommended by the board are followed. So they must ensure that the procurement entity, in making their decisions on procurement, they follow the various stages, the processes as laid down in this act, and we'll be looking at the various processes later on as we proceed. 2, ensuring that the procurement entities exercise sound judgment in making procurement decisions. So the tender committee is there to ensure that the procurement entities make their decisions in a sound judgment manner. What it means is that they perform their work without breaching others, without breaching contracts, without injuring others, and making it lawful so that people will not argue or people will not lay any claims against the entity. Then 3, referring to appropriate tender review board for approval beyond its authority. Now what happens is that there are certain decisions that the tender committee cannot take. For example, if a contract is awarded or a supplier is selected and a contract is awarded, then some of the tenderers or one of the tenderers is not happy with the decision of the procurement entity to give the contract or to award a certain other entity the contract, and they want to lay claims or they want to lodge complaints. When they lodge the complaint, they would have to look at it, what decision do we have to make. So maybe in that case, the tender committee cannot be able to handle the issue that is being raised, and they can send it to the tender review board for them to consider the issue and advise what must be done and what must not be done in relation to such issues. Then we come to the tender evaluation panel. The tender evaluation panel. This panel has the expertise to evaluate tenders and assess the tender committee in its works. So the tender evaluation panel is the team that puts together to evaluate and see whether our tenderers who have submitted their documents to be awarded contracts, whether they qualify. So this evaluation panel has the expertise to be able to look at that, and they also oversee the work of the tender committee. 2, they shall evaluate each tender according to the predetermined and published evaluation criteria. So each tenderer who will submit its document, which is an invitation document, shall be evaluated based on the predetermined criteria which is published. Now we will look at that later on, but let me throw some light on it briefly for you to understand what we are saying. Now when a public when a procurement entity publishes an advert to procure for goods for the nation or for an entity or for government purposes, in the publication you will realize that they say they are looking for A, B, C, and the people should have this type of capital, the people should have this expertise, the people should have paid their tax, the organization should be of this side. So all these are criteria that will qualify a tenderer to submit its document. So what we're saying here is that after submission of this tenders have come in, the evaluation committee would have to do their evaluation or perform their evaluation work based on the published criteria, not on any new criteria that the entity may have brought to them in the course of their work. So that is what the tender evaluation panel does. Then we come to the tender review boards. Tender review boards. At each level of the procurement process, the tender review board is established at a central level, ministerial level, regional level, and then district level. But note something. According to the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2016, Act 914, it has brought dissolution of district and ministerial tender review boards. So there is an amendment to the Public Procurement Act. It was first done in 2003, but in 2016 we have done an amendment, and that is the Act 1914, 914, and that act, when it comes to effect, in the act, it is suggesting that there should be a dissolution of district and ministerial tender review boards. But as it has not come into effect yet, it is in effect though, but as not everything has been put in place, still we have some of the district tender review boards and the ministerial tender review board. So what are the functions of the tender review boards? 1. Approval of the procurement process by the procurement entity. So when the procurement entity wants to undertake procurement and they say that we want to use this process, we want to use this procedure, we want to use this method, it is a tender review board that assesses it and then gives its approval of it. Furnish the procurement board with annual reports. So the tender review board furnish the procurement board with any report that is necessary to be done. Participate in public procurement forums. So public procurement forums, the tender review boards can participate in it because they are on the district level, they are on the regional level, they are on the ministerial level, and they are also on the central government level. So when it comes to any issue on procurement, because the district level oversees all districts, the regional level oversees the whole region, the ministerial level oversee the entire ministry, the central level oversee the central government public procurement issues. They have to participate in any public procurement forum that is organized by the Public Procurement Authority. And finally, reviews the decisions of heads of entities in respect of a complaint. So if any entity, any supplier brings complaint, the tender review board can look at it and decide what must be done and what must not be done. So that is what we mean when we talk about the tender review boards. I believe that the functions of those big entities and bodies in the public procurement will help you to understand what we are discussing. Now, local government, we will look at that later on as we proceed in relation to public procurement. Now, we want to consider procurement plan. A procurement entity prepares a procurement plan and submits it for approval, and a plan for approval by the tender committee, and shall indicate. So, before every year ends, every procurement entity prepares what we call a procurement plan. The procurement plan is a document prepared by the procurement entity to the tender committee for approval. And that procurement plan must contain contract packages, estimated cost for each contract package, the procurement methods, the processing steps and time, among others. So they will tell the tender committees, okay, next year we want to do A, B, C, and D, but we want to procure these goods. If we want to procure these goods, we want to use these methods. We want to do it at this time. We want to do it at that time. We want people to submit the document this time. We want to start the review process this time. We want to award the contract this time because the contract will take this length. So all these things are contained in what we call the procurement plan, and that procurement plan is submitted to the tender committee, and the tender committee approves it, and then it becomes effective for the procurement entity to use. Now that we've considered issues in relation to the structure and the procurement plan, we want to look at qualification of tenderers. Qualification of tenderers. Qualification of tenderers. A tenderer in public procurement shall. So, what are the qualifications that a tenderer should have before it will tender a document? What are the qualifications it should have? What are the requisites or criteria or the benchmark that they have to meet before they tender for public procurement services? A. Possess the necessary professional and technical qualification and competencies, very important. Financial resources, should have the money, should have the capital, it should be of a certain size. So if there is a contract to construct a school for a district, and the district is employing contractors, and you are coming as a firm, you are constructing a school. and you are coming as a construction firm, you should have a certain size, a certain capacity. If you have not undertaken that project before, or if you only deal with small scratches on people building, then you can, or you are a mason somewhere, you cannot qualify yourself and go to bid for you to be given that contract. So you must have the money, you must have the capacity, you must have the qualification, you must have the technical skills to be able to execute the contract that it's being served. Equipment and other physical facilities. So you should have the equipment, you should have the physical facilities to be able to execute the contract when it is awarded to you. So you cannot just go and say that, all right, the district assembly is saying they want to build a school. I'm a mason, so I can go there and take the contract. No. Do you have the machines? Do you have the equipment? Do you have the facilities to be able to undertake the contract? That question must be answered by the tenderers before they bid for any contract. B, have the legal capacity to enter into contract. So the tenderers should have the legal capacity to enter into contract. Be solvent, not bankrupt. Pay their taxes, very important. So you have to be a good corporate citizen before we can give you the contract, or before you can bid for the contract. Directors of the tenders are qualified and not declared bankrupt or illegal behavior. Pay social security fund and pay all compensation for pollution, if any. So it means that these are some of the things that tenderers would have to be able to bid or tender in their proposals for it to be considered by a procurement entity so that a contract may be awarded to them. Now, sometimes what happens is that before the procurement entity allow people to bring in their proposals, allow people to tender and come and bid for the contract under consideration or the contract on offer, the procurement entity can undergo or can undertake what we call pre-qualification procedures. Pre-qualification procedures. This is where the procurement entity invites people to come and look at the criteria to be met before one can apply or bid for that contract. So that is called the pre-qualification procedure. A procurement entity may engage in pre-qualification procedure to identify tenderers who are qualified prior to the submission of tenders. So we want to look at whether you are qualified before you bring in tenders, so that you don't submit your tender, then we look at it, then you are not qualified. It gives us a lot of job, a lot of work as a procurement entity. So we want to look at it. Do you qualify? If you qualify, you can submit your tenders. Now, there are times when tenders are submitted and they are rejected by the procurement entity. So a procurement entity may reject any tender when the tender fails to meet a qualification in the predetermined or published requirements. The grounds for rejection shall be communicated to the tenderer. So that is what we are saying. If there is a qualification you don't meet, for example, you are supposed to have an experience of 10 years and you have experience of 2 years and you are applying upon the basis of the fact that you have experience 2 years and you are looking for 10 years, then your proposal can be rejected or your quotation can be rejected. And when it is rejected, the procurement entity will communicate that your proposal was rejected because we are looking for 10 years experience and you only have 2 years experience. So that is what rejection of proposal is about. Now we want to look at the various methods through which the procurement entity can undertake procurement in the country. So there are about 4 methods that we are going to be discussing. 4 methods. The first one is called competitive tendering. Now, competitive tendering is used by a procurement entity when the procurement entity knows and have an idea of the specific of the goods, services, or works that they require. What does that mean? It means that with competitive tendering method, the procurement entity knows what they want. So if we want to build a school, a 6-story school, or we want to buy computers, HP computers, or we want to buy laptops, that kind of thing. So they know specifically the goods, the services, or the works that they desire. So in such cases, what the procurement entity does is that it only publishes the criteria and the invitation documents in the newspaper, and then people then see it and they apply for it. So when the procurement entity knows the specification of the goods, the specification of the service, the specification of the work, then it will procure the goods using what we call competitive tendering. Two-stage tendering. Now with two-stage tendering, this is where the tender process is divided into two. The first stage called invitation document, and the second stage called the tender proceedings. Now what happens here is that sometimes the procurement entity does not have an idea of the specifications of the work, of the service, of the goods that they want. So they want something, but they really don't have specifications of it. So in such cases, the stage of procurement is divided into two. The first one is called invitation document. So this is where suppliers are invited to come and furnish the procurement entity with some specifications, with some goods based on the description that the procurement entity has given out or has published. So when these invitation documents are sent in, then the procurement entity now has an idea, has the specification, then it moves to the second stage called the tender proceedings, where the normal tendering process goes on and people are allowed to submit their tender, and if you are selected, then the contract is awarded to you. Then restricted tendering. A procurement entity may, for a reason of economy and efficiency and subject to the approval of the board, engage in procurement by means of restricted tendering. So sometimes a procurement entity, instead of doing competitive, giving equal opportunities. One characteristic of competitive tendering is that the organization or the procurement entity gives equal opportunity to all tenders. It means everybody who qualifies can tender, and we give everybody equal opportunity because it is what? Competitive. But sometimes the procurement entity will employ, with consultation from the board or with approval of the board, will employ what they call restricted tendering. So in such cases, what they do is that for the reason of economy, money, for the reason of efficiency, time, and how urgent the thing may be, they will look at the restricted tendering. That is, only some few people should be allowed to come and tender. But there are conditions upon which the procurement entity can employ this method. The first one is called, if goods and services or works are available from only limited number of suppliers or contractors. So if what we are looking for is only available from some limited suppliers or producers, then we have to just do a limited or restricted tendering. If the time and cost required to examine and evaluate a large number of tenders is of excess, so we don't have the time, the money is too much. If we have to do it competitive, about 100 tenders will come in, but we don't have the time, we don't have the money, we just want to look at like 10 people, make the decision and go away. So let's do a restricted tendering. Then the last one is single source tendering. A procurement entity may engage in this method under Section 41 with the approval of the board. Conditions for single source. So here, it means that when the procurement entity wants the goods, instead of advertising, it just goes straight to one source, straight to one supplier, straight to one contractor, and then give him the contract for the work to be undertaken by, such an individual. But conditions must be met. One, where goods, works, or services are only available from a particular supplier, contractor, or tender. So if the goods we want, if the service we want, if the works we want is available from only one person, then we go for a single source, because he is the only person who can offer us the service. If that is, he is the only person, what is the need for competitive? What is the need for restricted? What is the need for two-stage tendering? Two, where there is an urgent need for the goods and works and services. So it is urgent. Maybe something has happened today and we need the goods tomorrow. We cannot advertise today, then go through the procurement process today and choose a supplier today. No, it is urgent. We need the thing tomorrow or 3 days from now. If that is the case, what do? Single source. Then we go ahead. Then, where there is an additional requirement from a supplier or contractor who has supplied the procurement entity with goods, services, or works. So, we procured some goods from a supplier, and the goods that the supplier supplied were not enough for the service that we want to undertake or for the work that we want to undertake. So when that happens and we want an additional goods from the supplier, from the contractor, or from the person from whom we procure the goods, then we would have to just employ single source procurement and take the goods from the person. Where the procurement entity thinks in the best interest of national security, a single source procurement method is used. So sometimes the procurement entity thinks that, hey, in the best interest of the country, for security purposes, let's just use a single source. For example, if the army want to procure for guns, want to procure for ammunitions, and they decide to publish it in the newspaper, then individuals will now come in and say that, okay, we will sell guns, we will sell guns. But if that happens, it means everybody will be exposed to guns. Like that. So what they do is that they don't advertise, they just go straight to one person, they just go straight to one procurement or supplier or contractor, contract the person, bring out the guns, and they keep it. For national security purposes, they have to protect that. Now, whether we are employing competitive two-stage tendering, restricted tendering, or single source tendering, there are two procedures that we can do these. We have what we call the national competitive tendering and the international competitive tendering. With national competitive tendering, this is where the procurement entity allows only citizens of the country, so citizens of Ghana are allowed to procure, or businesses in Ghana are allowed to send in or submit their tender documents for them to be considered for a contract. But if the procurement entity uses an international competitive tendering, then international organizations, international bodies will also be allowed to undertake or submit their tenders. Now, if the procurement entity is using competitive or the national competitive tendering, then the advert should be published in a national newspaper that has a wide spread, so that people from across the country can see it. Because remember, we say we want to give equal chance, equal opportunity to the suppliers, to contractors, or to contractors. Or if we are using international competitive tendering, then aside publishing it in a national newspaper with a wide spread, then it has to also be published in an international journal or in an international gazette, so that the international environment, the international committee, the international suppliers can also see it, and they can also bid for the contracts to be given to them. Now let's look at the procedure for inviting tenders. So how does the procurement entity invite tenders? So a procurement entity shall invite tenders by publishing a document called Invitation to Tender in the newspaper. If it's an international competitive tendering, the document must also be published in at least one international newspaper. We've already said that. Now, the contents of the invitation to tender. So these are the criteria against which the evaluation panel is going to take decision and choose a supplier or a contractor to be awarded the contract. Name and address of the procurement entity, specification of goods and place of delivery, time of delivery, criteria and procedure for evaluation, means of obtaining the invitation of documents, the price and currency, as well as means of payment for the invitation documents, the place and deadlines for submission of tenders, the place, time, and dates for the opening of bids. So these are some of the things that are included in the invitation document, which is published in the newspapers by the procurement entity. Sometimes the procurement entity publishes the thing, but later on realized that there was something they should include and they didn't include. So clarification and modification of tender documents. So sometimes also, so the procurement entity in such cases would clarify or modify or publish what we call an addendum. That is a document that gives clarification on a publication that is being made. So they will issue an addendum and then publish the addendum, and then that gives or clarify the invitation to bid. Suppliers, on the other hand, can also recommend or request from the procurement entity some clarification, modification of things that they don't understand in the invitation document. So a supplier may request promptly clarification of the tender documents from the procurement entity. The procurement entity shall, within reasonable time before the deadline for the submission of tender, respond to the request. So that is it. The procurement entity may modify the invitation document by issuing an addendum. I've already said that. That is a textual matter onto the publication prior to the deadline for the submission of the tender. So that is how they invite the tenders. Now, if they invite the tenders, they do what we call examination. The procurement entity may ask a supplier or a contractor for clarification of its tender in order to assist in the examination, evaluation, and comparison of tenders. Evaluation of tenders. The procurement entity shall evaluate and ascertain the successful tender in accordance with the procedures and criteria set out in the invitation document. We've been saying this over and over again, that a supplier or a contractor will be chosen based on the predetermined or pre-published criteria when the offer was being made or was being published. Upon choosing the successful tenderer, the necessary documents are signed and it comes into effect. Methods and procedures to procure consultants. Now, whether it is works, services, it follows the same order, all right? So if the procurement entity is not looking for goods, but is looking for the service of an accountant, IT service, service of auditors, it follows the same order. They publish it the same way, they choose based on the criteria, and it follows in the same order. Review. Right to review. Any supplier that claims to have suffered any loss or injury due to a breach of a duty imposed on the procurement entity by this act on the selection of the method for procurement, the choice of selection procedure, the limitation of procurement proceedings, the decision by the procurement entity. So any supplier, as I said earlier, who is not satisfied with the decision of the procurement entity has a right to lodge a complaint and for the procurement entity to review the entire process to see whether it was good or it was not good. Review by the procurement entity. A complaint shall in writing be submitted to the head of the procurement entity either before or after the procurement contract comes into force. The procurement entity shall within 21 days after the submission of the complaint issue a written decision concerning the complaint. So the procurement entity, a supplier has lodged a complaint. So in 21 days, they must sit down, look at the complaint of the supplier, and make a decision. Now, they will make a decision to explain to the supplier why they didn't give the supplier the contract or for answering the question that the supplier may raise. Now, if the supplier is not okay or is not convinced with the review decision of the procurement entity, then it goes higher to what we call administrative review. This is where the supplier writes the complaint officially to the procurement authority itself and lodge the complaint there at the procurement authority. That is called administrative review. Now, upon the receipt of a complaint, the authority shall give notice of the complaint promptly to the procurement entity. So the procurement board now give notice to the procurement entity that a supplier is saying that you did A, B, and C, and he has suffered loss and has been injured. So, what is your take on it? Then, the procurement entity can make a decision after querying the supplier who has lodged the complaint and the procurement entity. And the procurement authority can make a lot of decisions, among which includes the following. Declare the legal rules or principles that governs the subject matter of the complaint. Maybe there are some legal rules or principles that the supplier didn't understand. So the procurement authority will explain it to them. 2. Annul in whole or in part an illegal act or decision of the procurement entity. So you can say that, okay, the contract has been signed, but please, we can't award the contract. Go back. Do the procedure again. Revise an illegal decision by the procurement entity or substitute its own decision for the decision of the procurement entity. So the procurement authority now would want to substitute. So the procurement entity has made a decision, but we want to say, no, this decision you made is not good. The decision should be this, so we are taking this decision for you. And finally, order the procurement proceedings to be terminated. So these are what we refer to when we talk about administrative review. Now, let's look at disposal of stores, plants, and equipment. So, some of the goods have been procured, they have been used, but they have deteriorated or they are damaged, they are destroyed. How do we dispose them of? A. Authority to dispose. The head of a procurement entity shall convene a board of survey comprising representative of departments with surplus, unserviceable, and obsolete stores and plants and equipment. The board of survey recommendation is approved by the head of the procurement entity as to how to dispose the stores. So the procurement entity put together what we call a board of survey. This board of survey will make a recommendation on how the disposal of the stores should be made. Procedure for disposal: transfer to the government department, sale by public tender to the highest tenderers, sale by public auction, destruction, dumping, or burning as appropriate. So whichever way we want it, whichever recommendation they make, these procedure, whether we can sell it, whether we will destroy it outrightly, but it has to be transferred to the government department. Finally, we want to look at procurement by the district assembly, or what we call the local government. A storekeeper or head of spending units raises requisition by completing the activity and expenditure initiation form, which is approved by the head of MDA or MMDA's administration. Procurement officer makes request for, so the first thing, he raises a requisition completing an activity and expenditure initiation form. Second, procurement officers make request for quotation by inviting bids from potential suppliers. 3. Tender committees review the bid and select a supplier. 4. The procurement officer prepares the purchase order and sends to the accountant to ensure the transaction is properly charged and to commit the transaction against the budget allocation or warrant of the MMDAs. The accountant authorizes the purchase order and approves by the head of the MDAs as a warrant. The purchase order is sent to a supplier. Goods is received and inspected by the storekeeper and the audit team. So these are the procedure through which procurement is done at the local government. So 1, storekeeper or the head of the spending unit raises a requisition by completing a form called the activity and expenditure initiation form. That's the first thing. But the requisition that he is doing must be approved by the head of the local government, by the head of the ministry, by the head of the department, by the head of the agency, or by the head of the Metropolitan Municipal District Assembly. Very important. Then the procurement officer will make the request for quotation. So they will invite people to come and bid for the contract. Then the tender committee will make their procedure with evaluation committee. Then they select the supplier who should supply the goods. Then the procurement officer prepares a purchase order and sends to the accountant so that the various accounting entries will be made for the order. Then the accountant will authorize the purchases, which is approved by the head of the Metropolitan Municipal or District Assembly. And then the order is now sent to the supplier. The supplier brings in the goods. The goods are received by the procurement entity there at the local government. It is inspected by the storekeeper and an audit team. So these are what you have to understand when we come to public procurement. It's a very voluminous area, but we have tried to do this in less than 52 minutes. And we believe that these things will be able to help you. But the key takeaways that I want you to understand is the functions of this major people: the procurement authority, the procurement entities, the tender committees, the tender evaluation committee, the tender review boards. Their functions. Then you have to also take into consideration the methods of procurement: competitive, two-stage, restricted, and single source. Then you have to look at the various procedures through which procurement is done in the country, and we believe and trust that you will be able to excel in this. But you can be guaranteed that the examiner will always, in each examination sitting, will ask candidates questions in relation to public procurement, and when a question is asked, we know that you can be able to solve or answer the question to the examiner. Till we meet again in our next topic, all the best. Read your notes, watch this video over and over again. If you have any question, Do not worry, send me an email, NhyiraPremium@gmail.com or premium.edu.consult@gmail.com, and we here at Premium will be very happy to help you answer any question and help you to become the chartered accountant that you have desired to be. From the team here at Premium, we say bye for now and see you in the next session. Thank you.